Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this fifth of the SDSC Public Lecture series. My name is Iain. I'm the Shedden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU. As we're welcoming participants attendees who are coming in right now, please let me give them a few moments to find a seat. Please let's begin by acknowledging, celebrating, and paying our respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of the Canberra region and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work, and whose cultures are among the longest continuing cultures in human history. Thank you all for joining us this evening. A warm welcome to colleagues and students from the ANU and from other research institutions in Canberra, Excellencies, the Diplomatic Corps, friends from the Australian Public Service, possibly the media, concerned citizens, and stalwart supporters of SDSC's public events, many of whom I recognize in spite of masks. Thank you for making time to be with us here today. This is the fifth of the SDSC Public Lecture Series. The series was begun last year at the initiative of our late head of centre, Brendan Sargent. Brendan himself gave the first lecture in May last year on the imperative of developing strategic imagination for Australia and beyond in these challenging times. Brendan, of course, is very sorely missed at SDSC, as I know he is missed in the wider ANU and Canberra communities. This lecture series, of course, is intended to stimulate public discussion and debate on major challenges that relate to Australian strategy and defence, and also intended to contribute to the vital national conversations that we ought to be having about Australia's future in the Indo-Pacific. Brendan had a very specific idea when he started this series about how SDSC would contribute to these twin purposes. And one of the vital means by which he envisaged us making this contribution is for SDSC scholars to bring to the table our major currency, which essentially is our expertise based on research. Brendan continually, as many of us do, grappled with the fundamental problem of needing to inject new and fresh perspectives into many long and tired debates about strategic policy in Australia and in the region as well. In one of the last exchanges I had with him, we discussed the crying need for intellectual diversity in our academic and policy communities. When we have intellectual diversity, each of us has to work a lot harder to understand the points of views of those with whom we're engaging. Each of us at the same time has to work much harder to reveal, expose, and explain our assumptions, and to reveal and explain our claims based on evidence as well as logic. This, of course, if we had this process, creates a continual process of reflection, sharpening, and reevaluation that helps us to guard against stasis and helps our ability to grapple with complex problems, is how the logic of this conversation went that I had with Brendan. So this evening, in that spirit, I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Iain Henry, who is a proud son of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Iain first joined SDSC in 2008 as a master's student on our Strategic Studies program. He returned delightfully in 2013 as a PhD student in the center, and upon his graduation with his PhD in hand, he has been with us first as lecturer and more recently as senior lecturer at the center. Over the past 2 years particularly, Iain has had a flying start and has scored big as an academic. In 2020, he published his first major article in International Security, which is a top international journal in our field. And more excitingly and recently, his book out of his PhD thesis is out in advance and will be out on the bookshelves next month. Reliability and Alliance Interdependence, the United States and its allies in Asia, 49 to 69. Is out with Cornell University Press, hot off the press. There are little printouts with a QR code at the registration desk if you're interested in a small discount for an online purchase of the book. Iain's going to speak tonight of some themes which relate to that body of work, which I've just highlighted for you. In that body of work, he does us an important service in performing the archival and other research to overturn and to challenge some very foundational assumptions about how US alliances have worked in this region during and since the Cold War. So in tonight's talk, he's going to build upon that expertise and ongoing new research to speak to a question of immense significance for us today. The issue of the connection between the ANZUS Treaty and obligations of US allies in the event of a conflict across the Taiwan Straits. I'm going to turn the rest of the time over to Iain and leave you in his fascinating and capable hands. Please.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. And it would be very remiss of me at this opportunity to not thank Evelyn for her immense and character-building mentorship that she's given me over the last few years. If you do get a copy of that book, you will see that she's very warmly acknowledged in the acknowledgement section of it. Thank you, Evelyn. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Evelyn has said, this series was instigated by the late Brendan Sargent, my former boss, colleague and friend, who died unexpectedly in February. And I'd like to begin with a little reminiscence of how I've come to stand before you tonight. Last year, it may have been over a Friday afternoon whiskey with Brendan, he and I were discussing one of my current projects, which investigates what obligations, if any, Australia has under the ANZUS Treaty to assist in the defence of Taiwan. Brendan quickly insisted that I had to deliver a public lecture on this topic. I was a bit surprised and responded with all of the protestations you would expect from an academic. I'm still researching. I'm at least a year away from even submitting to a journal, even thinking about publication. But Brendan was not dissuaded, and he insisted that because the subject was of immediate importance, the risks of presenting research in progress were outweighed by other considerations. Brendan, of course, won the argument, and so I'm here tonight. One of Brendan's core convictions, based on his decades of honourable service to Australia, was that our strategic thinking is usually quite unimaginative. It tends to be rigid, lacking in introspection, and we often shy away from contesting long-held but contestable beliefs about the world and our place in it. Tonight, I'm going to try and shed some light on an issue of significant importance to Australia, but the public lecture must come with a very significant caveat. This is, indeed, research still in progress. There is so much data yet to be gathered, and the argument and conclusions that I'll explore tonight will change if new evidence is discovered in the coming months. My research question focuses on whether Australia has obligations under the ANZUS Security Treaty of 1951 to assist the United States in any defence of Taiwan against Chinese attack. In my talk tonight, I'll explain why I think this question is an important one, worthy of more attention than it has received in the past. We'll consider the text, of course, of the ANZUS Security Treaty, but then move on to perhaps a more interesting issue. How was the treaty negotiated, and how was it understood by those who did the negotiating? Answering these two questions helps us to contextualise and interpret the treaty accurately and fairly. We'll explore whether analogous scenarios can provide insight. Has ANZUS faced similar situations in the past? And if so, how did the alliance operate? Next, we'll consider something a little bit unusual, the idea that Australia may have made an alliance commitment which goes beyond the requirements of the ANZUS Treaty. And then we'll finally conclude by applying my findings briefly to the possibility of a fourth Taiwan Strait crisis. There'll be time for some questions and answer sessions at the end. One final note before I proceed. This public lecture is not addressed at the question of whether Australia should defend Taiwan or help the United States to do so. This is obviously a critically important issue, but it is not the focus of the research that I'll discuss tonight. Investing Australia's possible obligations is important for 5 reasons. The first is that we can see quite clearly that in the last 3 decades, American expectations of Australian support during a Taiwan Strait crisis have grown. In August of 1999, Richard Armitage, who was then an advisor to the presidential candidate George W. Bush, suggested that if the United States were to defend Taiwan against an attack from the People's Republic of China, then Washington would expect Australian assistance. He said, if we were taking casualties, we would not want our allies to stand by. An alliance means we work together. It wouldn't seem to me to be appropriate in an alliance for Australia to pick and choose. In August of 2001, Australia's Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, refuted the idea of an automatic Australian obligation under ANZUS, saying, I don't know that we have any obligations. There's nothing in ANZUS that's so specific. Within weeks, Armitage, then the Deputy Secretary of State, hinted that Australian inaction during a Taiwan crisis could indeed imperil ANZUS. If Canberra sat on the sidelines, then Washington, Armitage said, would have to take a look at where we are after the dust has settled. Downer tried to distance ANZUS from the Taiwan Strait, but recently one Australian minister has taken a very different line. The current Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, has claimed it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US in any conflict over Taiwan. He also claimed that this comment wasn't a pre-commitment, it wasn't anything other than a statement of reality. Dutton's comments do not really reveal whether he believes the ANZUS Security Treaty obliges Australia to assist the United States to defend Taiwan. But more generally, he has said that if we are a weak and unreliable and untrustworthy friend, then we won't expect the support of the United States into the future. He appears to believe that some obligation exists, even if it is only to prove our credentials as a loyal ally. These new positions come at a moment when the risk of conflict over Taiwan is increasing, mainly due to the actions of China and the United States. Any future Taiwan crisis will pose risks for Australia. If the US moves to defend Taiwan and Australia decides to assist, the ADF will probably engage Chinese forces in combat. Depending on whether and how such a conflict escalates, bases, facilities, and perhaps even population centres in Australia could be attacked in a variety of ways. But of course, if Australia chose not to participate and failed to fight alongside the United States to defend Taiwan, then significant damage to the ANZUS alliance is possible. Some, such as my colleague Professor Paul Dibb, argue that if Australia chose to not help, then the very survival of the ANZUS treaty would be at risk. These 3 factors combine to create what I consider to be a newly emerging conventional wisdom or consensus. Of course, Australia would help to defend Taiwan. As our Defence Minister says, it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US. But the source of this new position seems to be Australia's genuine and understandable concern at the growth of Chinese power, Beijing's horrific, repressive and illiberal style of governance, and China's international behaviour. The new consensus is not firmly based on any detailed understanding of how the security of Taiwan has previously featured in Australia-US relations. Australia's current mood towards China, combined with recent efforts to sanctify the Australia-US alliance, have created the risk of what one author calls imperative-driven judgment. This occurs when leaders act, quote, based on an overwhelming sense of what a country must do, rather than a primary and rigorous assessment of which course of action would best advance its interests and goals. It is foreign policy by moralistic duty. Given these developments, the time is right for a more thorough examination of Australia's possible obligations. Any consideration of these obligations under the ANZUS Security Treaty must of course begin with a consideration of the text itself. Those who argue that Australia is obliged to defend Taiwan often do so with primary reference to Articles 4 and 5 of the treaty, which would suggest that any attack against US forces defending Taiwan would activate Article 4 of the treaty. Article 4 pledges that if there is an armed attack in the Pacific area on any of the parties, then each would act to meet the common danger. Article 5 clarifies that an armed attack would occur if any member's armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific were attacked, though the Pacific area itself is not defined. If we ended our analysis here, the treaty text would seem to say very clearly that Australia does have an obligation to meet the common danger once US forces in the Pacific, say perhaps in the vicinity of Taiwan, were attacked. But to fully understand the text of the Security Treaty and any obligations therein, we must carefully examine how the treaty was negotiated and what the negotiators of the treaty understood these words to mean. Firstly, it must be noticed that America's initial desire after the Second World War was for a multilateral security pact in Asia. When President Truman appointed John Foster Dulles as his special representative, his instructions were to arrange a peace treaty to formally end the Second World War, and also a multilateral alliance which would link countries such as Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. Dulles was scheduled to visit this very city, Canberra, in March of 1951, and ahead of his arrival, the foreign ministers and senior officials of Australia and New Zealand decided to meet here to negotiate a common negotiating position. For clarity, in case anyone's unfamiliar with the history, the island of Taiwan was known at that time as Formosa, and the Republic of China, that is the Chinese nationalists, were led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and they controlled the island of Taiwan. New Zealand's diplomatic records show that both Wellington and Canberra agreed that, quote, Formosa should not be included in any Pacific defence arrangement. The Australian representative considered that it would be dangerous to leave the impression that Australia supported policies directed towards propping up the phantom regime of Chiang Kai-shek, who had a vested interest in a world war, end quote. Australia believed that Chiang wanted general hostilities in Northeast Asia because these will enable him to restart the Chinese Civil War and offer an opportunity to seize the Chinese communist-held mainland. While Australia and New Zealand agreed not to raise the matter with Dulles formally, New Zealand's minutes of this meeting record that, quote, it might be informally pointed out to him that Australia and New Zealand were not anxious to be parties to any use of Chiang Kai-shek's forces in the Far East, end quote. So we can see that even before formal negotiations for the ANZUS Treaty had commenced, Canberra and Wellington were both apprehensive about the risks which might arise if the United States tried to create a regional alliance pact which included Taiwan. Both countries, Australia and New Zealand, desired to avoid any security commitment to Taiwan. At the end of these negotiations with Dulles in Canberra, it was not certain that a trilateral security treaty, that is, ANZUS, would be the ultimate result. As Dulles left Canberra, a quadrilateral arrangement involving the Philippines, sometimes called PANZUS, was still a live possibility. This would have been reluctantly accepted by both Canberra and Wellington, but these two states did strongly prefer a trilateral alliance. In March, Australia's Foreign Minister, Percy Spender, wrote to Dulles, noting that Australian opinion, quote, would display some hesitation were the pact extended to include the Philippines, particularly since such opinion may apprehend a further extension of any such pact to include Chiang Kai-shek, an alliance with whose regime would be, from our point of view, impracticable. That's the end of the quote there. So we have Australia's Foreign Minister writing directly to the Special Representative of President Truman, telling him that Australia did not want a security association with Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China on Taiwan. Such an alliance would be, in diplomatic parlance, impracticable. Ultimately, Dulles understood and respected these concerns and recommended to Truman that a trilateral Australia, New Zealand, United States security treaty be signed. But this didn't mean that the ANZUS Treaty was completely independent from America's other security commitments in Asia. Although a multilateral Asian alliance was America's first preference, when this proved impossible, Dulles decided to form a regional security system consisting of a bilateral US-Japan alliance, a bilateral US-Philippines alliance, and the trilateral ANZUS alliance. In the eyes of the United States, there was some measure of interdependence between these treaties. In April of 1951, in Tokyo, Dulles claimed that, quote, an attack upon the US forces that were stationed in Japan, Okinawa, or the Philippines would deem to be an attack upon the US in the Pacific for the purposes of that pact, referring to ANZUS, assuming that this is made clear in the final drafting. Though this idea of interdependence, so far as the documentary record suggests, had not been discussed in the trilateral negotiations in March, the preamble to the ANZUS Treaty does note, quote, that the United States already has armed forces in the Philippines, administrative responsibilities in the Ryukyus, and armed forces in and about Japan to assist in the preservation and peace and security in the Japan area. I have not yet found any record of Australia accepting or rejecting Dulles's assertion of an Australian obligation to defend the Ryukyus or US forces in Japan. But Dulles, in the Foreign Affairs Journal in 1952, wrote that for the purposes of the US, Philippines and ANZUS treaties, quote, there would be an armed attack on the United States if there was an armed attack upon Okinawa, which the United States is administering, or an attack on the American armed forces stationed in or about Japan under the security treaty with that country. In this practical sense, the three security treaties and the Japanese peace treaty interlock, end quote. The three security treaties he refers to there, of course, the US-Japan Security Treaty, US-Philippines, and ANZUS. So we can clearly see through these declassified records, but also Dulles's public comments, that the US believed that if the Ryukyu Islands or US forces in Japan were attacked, then this would meet the definition of armed attack in the Pacific mentioned in Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty. Though the Ryukyu Islands were returned to Japan's administration in 1972, the US, of course, still maintains substantial military forces throughout Japan, and it seems that Australia would have an obligation under the ANZUS Treaty to act to meet the common danger if these US forces were attacked today. What we do not see in the available records is any evidence suggesting that the US believed this obligation to extended to US forces on or near Taiwan. Remember that although the presence of US forces in Japan and the Philippines was specifically mentioned in the preamble of the ANZUS Treaty, Taiwan is not. Instead, what we do see when we examine declassified US documents from the time is evidence showing that Washington understood and appreciated Australia's reluctance to ally with Taiwan. A 1952 State Department briefing prepared ahead of the first ANZUS Council meeting noted that, quote, the Australians objected to the inclusion of the Philippines because they feared the Australian public might hesitate in its acceptance of the pact, apprehending a further extension to include Formosa. It's worth noting here that that is almost a direct word-for-word quote of the letter that Spender sent Dulles. So thus, Australia's unwillingness to associate itself with Taiwanese security was well known in Washington at that time. There's also additional evidence that not only were Australia's concerns appreciated by the rank and file of the State Department in Foggy Bottom, but also by the most senior of US officials. John Foster Dulles served as Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration. In this role, he had regular and sustained interaction with Australian officials, especially on issues of Northeast Asian security. Thus, we can examine his words and behaviour in this role to investigate how he understood, interpreted and operationalised the ANZUS alliance. His interpretation of the treaty must be given significant weight, as he was the American who negotiated not only ANZUS, but also the US-Japan Security Treaty, the US-Philippines Mutual Defence Treaty, and the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which formally ended the Second World War. During a Senate committee hearing in 1954, Dulles was quizzed as to why America had not created an Asian NATO in the early 1950s. Dulles replied that something along these lines had been his initial goal, and although he thought that such a development would be, quote, very fortunate, he did not think that it, quote, could be achieved at any early practicable date. In answering this question, Dulles noted that America's friends in Asia were clearly not cooperating with each other, and he observed that there were some, quote, rather sharp differences between some of them. In explaining these differences, Dulles made an ambiguous reference to Australia and New Zealand's attitude towards United States relations with Formosa. Seen in context and based on his earlier negotiations in Canberra with Australia and New Zealand, it is very likely that Dulles was suggesting that Australia and New Zealand's unwillingness to ally with the Republic of China was one of the key reasons why a multilateral alliance in Asia was not feasible at that time. It's also worth posing a counterfactual at this point. If I'm completely wrong, and if Secretary of State Dulles did believe that Australia had an obligation to assist in the defence of Taiwan, what evidence might we find to support this hypothesis? In the 1950s, while Dulles was Secretary of State, two separate crises occurred in the Taiwan Strait. If Dulles thought that Australia had an obligation to Taiwan's security, then almost certainly he would have commented on this during these crises. I've conducted extensive archival research on this period. I've spent months in the US National Archives and in various presidential libraries examining these declassified documents, and I found no evidence to suggest that Dulles held such beliefs. To my knowledge, at no point during either the first or second Taiwan Strait crisis did Dulles suggest that Australia had treaty obligations to Taiwan's security. So in sum, I have found no evidence, at least none yet, on the US side to suggest that in the 1950s there was any belief that ANZUS committed Australia to assist in the defence of Taiwan. There was, however, an understanding that if US forces in Japan were attacked, then this would activate the treaty. There is evidence showing that from Australia's perspective, Canberra's unwillingness to take on security obligations to Taiwan had been clearly communicated to John Foster Dulles, and we can see an awareness of these concerns within the rank and file of the US State Department in 1952, but also in Dulles' own mind in 1954. And finally, I have not yet found any evidence in either the first or second Taiwan Strait crisis to suggest any official US belief that Australia was committed to assist in the defence of Taiwan. Now, we could end the investigation there, but when we think about the possibility of Australian commitments to Taiwan, it's worth looking for situations that might be roughly analogous. We might flip the roles and ask, has Australia ever committed military forces somewhere in the Pacific, with the result that the US had to ask itself the kind of hard questions that Australia will face in prospective Taiwan crisis scenarios? During Konfrontasi, or the confrontation era, Australian forces were stationed in Malaysia and Singapore as part of its Commonwealth defence obligations. This is quite important because Australia's military obligations under the Commonwealth were unlike the prospect of US forces on or near Taiwan, specifically mentioned in the preamble of the ANZUS Security Treaty. So although this situation is somewhat analogous, it must be noted it is not a perfect like-for-like comparison. My colleague at the University of Sydney, Professor James Curran, has explored the tensions within ANZUS at this time. Australia was anxious to be reassured that if its soldiers came into conflict with Indonesian forces, then ANZUS would be activated. But the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, Avril Harriman, could provide no such assurances. When he visited Australia in 1963, he, quote, did not think that the US would let Australia down, but he could make no commitments. There was a grey area between the two countries. As Treasurer, Harold Holt met with President Kennedy and suggested that if Australian troops in North Borneo were attacked by Indonesian guerrillas, then ANZUS would be activated. Kennedy replied that this notion was, quote, not what the United States thinks. This was not the US view. An even blunter assessment was delivered to the then Minister for External Affairs, Garfield Barwick, when he visited Washington. JFK said that the American, quote, people have forgotten ANZUS and are not at the moment prepared for a situation which would involve the United States. Despite a period of tension, a joint agreement was eventually struck. A White House briefing document prepared during the administration of Nixon notes that, quote, in 1963, we reached a secret understanding with Australia. The US acknowledged that Malaysia and Singapore are in the Pacific area. The US recognised an obligation to act should Australian forces be overtly attacked, but not in the case of subversive acts or guerrilla attacks. The United States would expect to be consulted prior to any redeployment of Australian forces in Malaysia/Singapore, and the use of armed forces, particularly ground forces, would depend upon requirements and could not be assured. This same document described the US as having taken, quote, a guarded position as to the applicability of ANZUS. America's obligation to Australia in this instance is stronger than any possible obligation that Australia might have to assist in the defence of Taiwan under the ANZUS Treaty. This is because Australia's Commonwealth defence obligations are specifically recognised in the preamble to the ANZUS Security Treaty, whereas the possibility of American forces on Taiwan or an American guarantee of Taiwanese security are not mentioned. Despite this, the US never made an especially firm commitment. The secret understanding reached in 1963 was confined to subversive acts or guerrilla attacks and hinted that no ground forces would be supplied. Though America's treaty obligations were more clear-cut, it took only what it described as a guarded position. In contrast, although Australia has no treaty obligations to assist America in a defence of Taiwan, the current Defence Minister has described Australian non-involvement as inconceivable. So far, we've considered what Australia's obligations might be given the text of the ANZUS Treaty itself and the views of those who negotiated it and implemented it during the 1950s. One prospect worth considering is that an Australian commitment to assist in the defence of Taiwan, not technically required under the ANZUS Treaty, but rather freely assumed by Canberra as an additional responsibility, may have privately been given by an Australian government to the United States. I know this idea, some might call it a secret commitment, will seem to many as preposterous, but there are clear examples of similar responsibilities being assumed within the US-Japan alliance during the Cold War. As I explore in my first book, which is officially released next month, in 1960, Japan gave the United States secret commitments about the use of bases in Japan for the defence of South Korea. And in 1969, it provided certain assurances to the US about the use of bases in Japan for the purposes of conflict in Vietnam and for the defence of South Korea and Taiwan. These were essentially Japanese promises to assist in the defence of South Korea, Taiwan and South Vietnam by providing the US access to bases and facilities in Japan. And they made this promise even though the text of the US-Japan alliance itself did not impose any such obligations on Japan. A similar Australian promise pertaining to Taiwan is not unthinkable. There is no direct evidence, though, to suggest that Australia has provided such a commitment today. But there are some interesting developments to be observed. After the AUKUS agreement was announced, prominent voices in US policy circles saw this as Australia irrevocably siding with the United States. As a result, US expectations of Australian assistance in future military conflicts in Asia seem to have increased. Professor Aaron Friedberg, formerly a senior US official, wrote that if there's a war, Australia will have to fight alongside the US, while an unnamed senior official in the Biden administration said that AUKUS binds decisively Australia to the United States for generations. I would like to now again be very, very clear. There is no direct evidence of Australia having given the US a secret promise to participate in the defence of Taiwan. It is a possibility, not a probability. But comments from Australian ministers, from US officials, signal increased American expectations and a much greater Australian willingness to publicly speculate about the defence of Taiwan. It's possible that a secret undertaking has been offered, either as part of negotiations over AUKUS or a more general intensification of the US-Australia alliance, but there is now no direct evidence of such an agreement. What does all this mean if there is, catastrophically, another Taiwan Strait crisis in the future? A few preliminary conclusions. Firstly, it would benefit Australia if we carefully examined our implicit theories about how alliances work and how we apply these theories to decisions of war. Defence Minister Dutton has claimed that if we are a weak and unreliable and untrustworthy friend, then we won't expect the support of the United States into the future. But why would we be untrustworthy if we actually have never promised to help defend Taiwan? Implicit in Dutton's comment is a theory of reciprocal loyalty, the notion that if we are loyal to the US, then as a result, they will be loyal to us in the future. This idea has long been a key influence on Australian strategic thinking. It's not clear, however, that alliances truly do work this way. It seems very instinctive and natural to us that they should work this way. But alliances between states are not friendships between humans. Reasonably recent history shows that Australia's expectations of US support have been dashed when such commitments were not in Washington's interest. During the East Timor crisis, John Howard tried to secure a large ground force contribution from the US, but was rebuffed. Later, after leaving office, it should be said, he described this as a poor repayment of past loyalties and support. So we should be very cautious about letting this idea of reciprocal loyalty having a decisive influence on Australian policy choices over Taiwan. As for the other side of the coin, we should be sceptical of claims that Australia's non-participation would inevitably risk the abrogation of ANZUS. My colleague Professor Paul Dibb puts this rather bluntly, and he says that if we refuse, the very survival of the ANZUS treaty would be at risk. I agree with him to an extent. Such a dire outcome is possible, but it is certainly not guaranteed. Depending on the outcome of a conflict over Taiwan, the United States may have an even greater need and dependence on its allies in Asia. For example, if America lost a limited conflict over Taiwan, but desired to remain active in the region and prevent any further Chinese expansion, then ANZUS could become more important and more valuable to Washington, even though Australia had not participated in the unsuccessful defence of Taiwan. We should definitely consider the possibility of alliance harm resulting from non-participation, but we shouldn't regard it as a historical inevitability. We should also note that if we do participate in the defence of Taiwan, but lose the war, then the survival of the ANZUS Treaty could also be at risk, as America may decide to cut its losses and reduce its commitments and presence in Asia. Some argue that if the United States fails to defend Taiwan, then this will destroy US credibility beyond any repair, and that its leadership role in Asia will be finished. But the exact obverse is possible too. A failed attempt to defend Taiwan could significantly decrease America's military strength, and this might precipitate a sudden redrafting of its defensive line in Asia. Another risk, which is relatively undiscussed in the present debate, is that assertions of obligation, like that Dutton implies, which are based more on sentiment than evidence and history, raise the risk of increased expectations being ultimately disappointed. Though Defence Minister Dutton's comments imply that Australia has an obligation to be a loyal ally and thus help America defend Taiwan, I argue that these ideas are not based on a close and careful reading of the ANZUS history. But if our American friends internalise these comments and thus take future Australian support for granted, then they will be even more bitterly and viscerally disappointed if any future Australian government decides to sit on the sidelines. Prudent alliance management will involve careful delineation between the policies of a specific Australian government, which cannot bind its successors, and the commitments codified in the ANZUS Security Treaty, which has been endorsed by the Australian Parliament. Finally, although the issue of Taiwan has recently taken on much greater prominence in Australian discussions and debate, rarely do these exchanges explore the possibilities fully, openly, and in a detailed manner. This means that if a crisis were to develop at short notice, the temptation for that imperative-driven judgment that I discussed earlier would be intense and extremely difficult to resist. The political scientist Michael Mazar writes that, quote, "Imperative-driven judgment of this sort takes hold when leaders or decision-making groups come to believe that a given policy has the status of a duty or necessity. It is a kind of non-consequentialist thinking, a choice focused on the act itself rather than its results. The public debate begins to revolve around passionate, dogmatic statements of exigency rather than more nuanced assessments of prudential strategies." Defence Minister Dutton has said it's inconceivable that Australia would not help America to defend Taiwan. In this claim, it is easy to identify an element of imperative-driven thinking. But the Australian debate is not enriched by broad sweeping assertions and emotive invocations of the so-called lessons of the 1930s. This kind of approach only encourages the bifurcation of the debate into camps of supposedly Chamberlain-esque appeasers and principled Winston Churchill types, perpetually shouting past each other. Australian policy would benefit from a more open and mature discussion of the possible contingencies, risks, and consequences that may occur in the coming years. Obtaining a better understanding of the ANZUS Treaty and how its creators understood and implemented it is just one component of this essential discussion. Thank you.